On that note, I will hand over to our first pair of speakers. We've got Ross Ballard and David Peck, who are from SARDI, and Ross is going to introduce the project. And over to you, Ross. You've got about 20 minutes.
Okay, thanks, Tanya. I'll just share my screen now. How's that looking? People are nodding. Very good. Okay. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Today, we're just going to give an overview of the Dryland legume pasture systems project and also some general advice on what we understand of pastures in dryland mixed farming systems. I'd just like to acknowledge the many people that have contributed to the program. And we'd also just like to acknowledge our funders, primarily Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment, GRDC, MLA 8WI, and also our grower group partners on the right side of the slide. Just a little roadmap of what David and I will talk about, and then the rest of the group. David and I are going to talk about some of the current legume options. Then we'll talk about some of the legumes in development. And then briefly we'll talk about some of the legume establishment methods as an entree to Bonnie and Rick's talk. And then we'll be followed by Bonnie and Rick with establishment and system benefits, and finally some local observations of legume performance from Ali Frischke, Michael Moodie and Alan Bennett. So today we'll be talking about, in terms of legume options, I guess broadly two groups. We'll be talking about the traditional pasture legumes, and in these low rainfall systems we're talking about the annual medics, and these are sort of have a long history of performance in these environments, but perhaps their Achilles heel is that they're vacuum harvested, and so seed supply is often or can be short or expensive. And there's a range of alternative legume species down the bottom of that graphic, which include things like French Ceradella, rose clover, bladder clover, and trigonella, which have the potential to be aerially harvested. And so the questions we're asking is how do these alternative legumes stack up against the medics and vetch for that matter? And do they have any potential to provide advantages in our systems? And just a very brief overview of where the trials are. So the work has taken place from Western Eyre Peninsula right over to central Victoria in Ali's neck of the woods. And within that, there's been 4 key system trials, one at Minapa, one at Waikerie, Lameroo and Piangle, and Bonnie and Michael will talk about those in more detail later. So I'll now hand over to David Peck, who will talk about some of the current annual legume pasture options for low rainfall mixed farms.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. So this is a typical lay pasture photo that you'll be familiar with. So the lay pastures have high levels of hard seeds. They can persist through 1 or 2 or 3 wheat crops and then germinate with the opening rains and have high quality feed for, in this case, the lactating ewes and the actively growing lambs. So I'd like to introduce the different alternative pastures. I'd like to give you a little history lesson here, and that'll understand where we are and where we might be going. So along the top is the history of annual medics. You can see the barrel medics came on board in the late 40s, followed by strands, disc and burr medics. So that's the 4 key species of medics. And so then from the 80s, we had the aphid problem. So we had aphid resistant lines. We developed the softer burr medics. We got the SU tolerant medics, and more recently, we got the powdery mildew resistant burr medics. So they've had a very long history of performing in our neutral to alkaline soils. On the bottom there, you've got the history of the alternative ones. These have largely been developed in WA on more acidic soils. So you got yellow Ceradella in the late 50s. it was not commercially taken up very widely. So then you have your French Serradella. It's in pink because it was soft, so it's not a lay pasture system. But from the late 90s onwards is when these alternative pastures started to come on stream and started to be available. So they have later development, they're less sophisticated, and they've got fewer cultivars. So most of those species, there's only one cultivar that has been commercially adopted. So just to give an example of the strand medic development, so you had the original cultivar Harbinger in 1959. When the aphids came on board, you did the aphid breeding. So it was basically Harbinger, which is aphid resistant. Then you had mutation breeding to develop Angel, the tolerant to SU herbicides. And then also the Jaguar. So more recently, Angel was crossed with PM2 is the powdery mildew parent, but it itself had very good agronomic performance. So in this case, we can select very heavily for dry matter production and not just the traits of interest, namely SU and powdery mildew resistance. So Seraph has got high soil adaptation, early flowering, ideal hard seed levels, it's blue-green aphid resistant, it's tolerant to SU herbicide residues, and it's tolerant of powdery mildew. So just to show you some more information on Seraph, you can see in the top right-hand photo there, it's powdery mildew resistant. The graph below across 15 sites. Across 15 sites, Seraph had 15% higher dry matter production than the old cultivars. So this is a typical example of the SU herbicide resistance. SU residues persist for 1 to 5 years, and they can be damaging at 75% reduction of dry matter 2 years after an application. So the current medic cultivars tolerant of SU herbicides include Sultan SU, Seraph, Jester SU, and Penfield. So on the left here is the traits of importance for legume success. So as a breeder, you run through a checklist here, and as a field evaluator, you do the same. But as a farmer, you might be interested in certain ones of these more than others. So number 3, time of flowering, you need to match the time of flowering of cultivars that you're interested into your rainfall. Suitability of livestock. So you need to be aware that Biserrula can cause photosensitization in sheep. And you might be interested in particular tolerance to pests and diseases, number 8 down there. So if you're a big picture man, that's what's in the blue. You know, what rainfall have you got? Match it with your flowering time. What soil type do you have? What are the claims in regards to soil textures and pHs of species and cultivars that you are interested in? So this is an example of growing an alternative pasture at Minipa. So you can see a plot not performing well there, which is French Serradella. It's not enjoying the alkaline soils at Minipa. So you need to be aware of your soil textures, your pHs, and what the claims are for the different species. A species may have a trait that you want. For example, you might be interested in harvesting your own pods and summer sowing. But if the species is not suited to your soil type, it will not be successful. We also suggest if you're interested in new species, sow small test strips, perhaps up and down a slope where they can grow on a range of pHs and soil textures, and you can see where they have a fit on your farm. So here is 3 more sites for French Serradella. You can see the 2 on the left. You would grow medics at those 2 sites. But on the right there at speed on a neutral sand, the French Serradella well and truly outperformed the medics. So it's worthwhile asking yourself these questions. Are there soil types on your farm where you can grow these alternative species? So with these lay pastures, another thing you need to be aware of is how do they perform after regeneration. So this is plant emergence as a percent of Seraph medic. So you can see Seraph medic is the highest. SARDI rose, the bladder clover and French Serradella, while reduced, they still are performing reasonably well. They just take a little bit longer before you can do your first grazing. Whereas Triggerella on the right, we would say that has failed to regenerate well after a crop. So this is a stoplight graph to show you what's possible for a range of different traits. So it lists the species down the left. And so we got the first column there, which is alkaline soils, which we think are dominant in the area we're talking to today. So the medics certainly perform best on those alkaline soils. So some of these other ones, so your French and your yellow Serradellas in your red, if you've got acid soils, you'll certainly start to think about these alternative species. So some of these alternative species, they've got a chance if you're neutral or below. So suitable hard seeds, you can see there, we think the medics have got the best performance in regards to hard seeds. If ability to harvest your own seed, you can see that the medics are the worst performers there. It's not in a real red because we're also starting some work where we think if you do some early desiccation, it might be possible to harvest your own medic pods. So further to the right is some other traits that we'll touch on at other parts of the talk. So in the summary of the current legume options, the medics have performed best on neutral to alkaline soils. Alternative legume species have been largely developed in WA on acidic soils. They can be aerial harvested. They can perform well, so you need to target acidic to neutral soils. And we suggest that you sow small areas up and down a slope to experience a range of soil textures and pHs. But now moving on to some legumes in development. So 2 new barrel medic cultivars. They don't come out of the DLPS project, but rather from MLA and S&W seeds. So on the left, we've got Emperor barrel medic, which is tolerant of powdery mildew resistance. And we've got Penfield on the right, which is a spineless barrel medic. So it's got tolerance to SU herbicides, boron tolerance, and aphid resistance. There's some material from the DLPS project that is progressing well. So we got Dismedics where we're selecting material that can fix more nitrogen. So that photograph in the top right, you can see that 2 on the edge are performing well across a range of different rhizobiums in the soil, whereas the 2 in the middle against those specific rhizobiums, they're not fixing much nitrogen. So at the bottom is an example of some of our burr-medic work. So we're working on boron tolerance and red-legged earth mite resistance. So we're also trying to bring some new aerial seeded options. So Triggerella is a new species. We have developed some hard seeded lines, and we're CSIRO are doing some duty of care animal grazing studies for that. So arrowleaf performs well on the alkaline soils, but we're trying to develop an earlier line, which happens to be also 30% extra dry matter. And bladder clover is coming out of the Western Australian program, which more than some of the other ones has got a bit of a role to play in at least mildly alkaline soils. So handing back to Ross.
Thanks, David. So I'm now just going to very briefly touch on some rhizobium and legume establishment issues. So in terms of these legumes, if you are going to inoculate them yourselves, the first thing to do is to make sure you're using the correct inoculant group. And I'll just bring your attention to the Inoculation Legumes Practice and Science manual. This has just been recently revised and sits on the GRDC website, and it provides comprehensive information on each of the legume species and the inoculation requirements for them. So have a read of that. Very briefly, there are a range of different inoculation groups for the different species of pasture legumes. There are 2 for the annual medics. So the strand and disc medics are required the AL inoculant. All other medics require the AM inoculant. If we get Triggerella over the line, that will also require the AL inoculant. It's related to the medic species. We see a little bit of confusion between vetch and medic because they tend to be grown in the same environments, but they have very different rhizobial requirements. So just make sure you're using the E or F strain on vetch, not the medic inoculants. Serradella is inoculated with the group S, but can also be inoculated with group G because with lupin it shares the same rhizobium species and the performance of the two inoculant strains is quite subtle. And finally, Biserrula, if you're attempting to grow it, it has a very specific rhizobium requirement. It hasn't been used in Australia for a very long time, for too long. And so it's almost always responsive to inoculation and it has a specific inoculant. Just touching on some of the species and the likelihood you'll get an inoculation response. With the medics, where you have a history of medic in the system and you're on high pH soils, there will already be populations of rhizobium in those soils. However, we have observed frequently in the SA Vic Mallee that they are still inoculation responsive, probably because the time between medic phases has increased and also the pH in those environments has also come down. The other point I'd make is that the strand medics tend to have fewer nodules, maybe less than 10 nodules. We recommend they have at least 5. That is just a characteristic of the species, not evidence of nodulation failure, but that's specific to the strand medics. In the clover space, the two to look out for specifically are bladder and clan clovers. While many soils contain high populations of clover rhizobium, the bladder and clan clovers are blinkered in their view of those populations, so they only see a very small part of the population, so it is mandatory that they are inoculated. Serradella, we recommend the best way to get Serradella established is where you've previously had a lupin crop, because that guarantees that you have a good population of rhizobium in the soil. Still inoculate it, but that background population will also support a good level of nodulation. And finally, as we previously mentioned with Biserrula, very specific symbiosis, almost certain you won't have rhizobium in the paddock. So inoculate it, use the correct inoculation strain, and use higher rates of inoculant for that species. Very briefly, I'll talk about pasture establishment. And just to keep in mind that with annual pastures, the main aim in the pasture establishment year is really to set up the seed bank. That's the primary goal, to set up the seed bank for long-term persistence of that pasture. And there's probably 3 main levers that you can use to do that. The first is seeding rate, the second is time of seeding, and the third is seeding depth. And Bonnie will cover some of this a little more later on, but we'll just have a brief look at some of these issues. So this just highlights the impact of seeding rate on early pasture dry matter production. And you can see the bottom line at 1 kilogram per hectare. It takes 100 days to get to around 1,000 kilograms of dry matter, whereas up at 10 kilos per hectare, at the same sort of period of days, you're getting around 3,000 kilograms of dry matter. So seeding rate is one of the easiest levers you can pull to get early dry matter production in those pastures. Recommended rates for things like the medics are 5 to 10 kilograms per hectare, but practically people are using 2 to 5, but we'd encourage them to get the rates up a bit if they can. The second lever is time of seeding, and Bonnie will talk about summer sowing, which is more used in WA and New South Wales, and particularly around Serradella and bladder clover. It relies on sowing hard seed in February that then breaks down and germinates on the break. The benefits being that you may be able to harvest your own seed on farm of these species, and so you can plant it earlier and get it out of the way of the cropping program. And the other big benefit here is that it provides earlier feed. Like all crops, if you get them in early, you get earlier production. And so the question is, can this concept of summer sowing used in WA and New South Wales be used in Victoria and South Australia in our environments, and is it applicable to species such as medics? And Bonnie will cover some of that. just a little bit of maths, again, coming back round to the sowing rates. Just be aware, if you are sowing summer sowing pods, your sowing rates have to be increased to achieve success. Because if you look at something like French cerebella, in the first column, you can see that only 50% of the pod is seed. So for a start, you need to double your sowing rate to achieve the same rate if you were sowing germinable seed on the break of the season. And secondly, only a proportion of that softens. So to achieve an equivalent 5 kilogram sowing rate by summer sowing, you've got to put out around 17 kilograms of pod. And in the case of the medics, which have a lower percentage of seed in pod and harder seeded levels, those sowing rates are increased again. So just to keep that in mind, if you're going to go to summer sowing, you've got to increase your sowing rates quite dramatically. So just to summarise what David and I have talked about, across a wide range of environments in the low rainfall cropping systems, medics have proved to be most reliable on the neutral, alkaline, sandy loams. Having said that, there have been instances where the other legumes have done well, sometimes outstandingly well, so long as they're on the right soil type that they're adapted to. The caveat there is you need to think about persistence through the cropping system. Medics will almost guarantee that they come back after a couple of years of crops, whereas some of these other species are less reliable in that regard. We point to Serif Medic and Frano Ceradella as some recent releases that are worth having a try with, and there's a number of further releases planned. And I guess just at the end of the day, we'd encourage where possible to up your seeding rates to ensure more reliable pasture establishment and early production. And we'll leave it there. Thanks, Tanya.
Thanks very much, Ross and David. That was really good.
I'll just unshare my screen.
Yes, please. And in the interest of time, we're going to keep moving on to the next speaker. So I will let Bonnie Flohr and Rick Llewellyn, both CSIRO research scientists, they're going to be running the next section. That's for the next 20 minutes. And I just encourage everyone that's just jumped on board to post any questions you have in the chat, and we will get to those at the end of each speaker if we have time. And then if we run out of time with the speakers, we'll do it at the end. So yeah, please feel free to post questions as we go. Over to you, Bonnie.
Okay, you can see and hear me?
Yes.
Cool, great. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. So I've got three parts of my talk today. I'm talking about some novel establishment methods, the crop benefits of including a pasture in the rotation, and then I'll hand over to Rick, who will talk about the economic side of things. So before we can really talk about novel establishment methods for pasture production, we all know what really drives plant establishment in the Australian context is when the seasonal break occurs. So as part of this project, we did some modelling to try to define when this seasonal break occurs across the Australian wheat belt. So we used historic climate data from 1971 to 2018 and opened the sowing window from the 1st of March to the 30th of July. The sowing opportunity was defined as when the sum of the 7-day rainfall is greater than the sum of the 7-day evaporation, triggered a sowing event. So using these rules, we produced this map, and you can see it generally follows seasonal rainfall distribution patterns. So in Western Australia and South Australia, where we have more Mediterranean type rainfall patterns, we have a later seasonal break, and the eastern states really get that early establishment advantage. So this map, or this analysis is useful because it can provide farmers, breeders and researchers with regional information regarding tactical cultivar and management decisions. So to zoom in on a few sites that are included in as part of this project, the median seasonal break ranged from the 1st of May to the 24th of May, and the range in seasonal break was between 40 and 60 days, so it's highly variable. And the rainfall required to trigger a sowing event in our analysis, the sum 7-day rainfall ranged between 20 and 30 millimetres, And I think that matches quite well how we think of the seasonal break on the ground. So we had 3 establishment methods experiments at Waikerie, Lamoureux and Piangle. And I'll just be talking about the core species of strand medic, bladder clover, French Ceradella, Trigonella and rose clover. And so these species were chosen because they've had success in WA and also have the potential for on-farm harvesting. So just to go over the establishment methods we tested, twin sowing was when hard pasture seed or unsclarified pasture seed was sown with the previous year's crop, and it sat underneath the crop for a whole growing season to germinate on the following year's seasonal break. Ross talked about summer sowing, so that's when the hard seed is sown in February. The hard seed breaks down over autumn to establish on the seasonal break. And these were compared to the control of autumn sowing, which is soft pasture seed sown into moist soil after the seasonal break. So the potential benefits there are closing the autumn feed gap by getting earlier establishment and also reducing labour conflicts with the main cropping program. So for each site, I have a figure like this, which is showing biomass on the y-axis and the different species on the x-axis. And for each autumn, summer and twin sown treatments, there's a number above each column, which is the plants per metre square. So in Waikerie in 2019, we had a below average rainfall and the break occurred on the 9th of May. And what this meant was that all the establishment treatments sort of established within a week or 2 of each other. So we didn't see that early establishment advantage. So at Waikerie, everything established well by those numbers, but production was just generally low. And this was due to a combination of both low rainfall and a soil type not being, the varieties not being well adapted to this soil type. And Medic was the standout suited to Waikerie. So the little asterisk on vetch there is just that some kangaroos or rabbits ate some of our vetch, so that vetch is lower than we anticipated. So moving on to the Piangle data. So this was by Michael Moodie and Roy Latter. So they also had a below average growing season and their break occurred at a similar date. So again, everything sort of established within a week or 2 of each other. And here, rose clover and Ceradella performed well against Medic, and the site also had greater success with the summer and twin sowing methods. And some 2021 regen data, which followed after a cereal year phase, found that Medic, Biserrula, rose clover and bladder clover and gland clover, regenerated well after the cereal crop, but Ceradella didn't regenerate quite as well, suggesting persistence through the cropping phase. We're a bit unsure about that, but Michael Moodie will be talking about these species a bit more when we hand over to him. So in 2020, we had a repeat of the experiment, but unlike the other 2 sites, we had an above average rainfall and the break occurred in early April. And here we saw bladder clover and Trigonella with the highest production and establishment for both autumn and summer sowing. And if you look at rose clover and French Ceradella, they established okay from autumn sowing, but the production was generally low, suggesting they're not well suited to that environment. So as we saw there across the 3 different sites, there was some variability between the success of summer and twin sowing. So what I was interested in was this being driven by the species suitability to the particular environment, or was there also an associated management factor of seeding depth? So to look into that, I set up a little pot experiment that grew bladder clover, Medic, Ceradella and Trigonella at 3 different depths and found that a depth greater than 3 centimetres reduced emergence by about 50%. So unless you've got good depth control like Michael Moodie's seeder was set up, I wouldn't recommend twin sowing unless that depth is controlled. So we also set up this experiment for vetch, which with under some greater depth, so between 5 and 16 centimetres depth. And there was no significant difference in emergence, but there was a shoot biomass penalty with 16 centimetre depth. So that shows that vetch is quite resilient against planting depth. So I just wanted to head back to the Lamoureux site of the establishment method experiment, just because it highlights a neat piece of data with the different systems. So after the establishment methods were tested at Lamoureux, everything was sown to scepter wheat. And at the start of the growing season, after the pasture treatments, there was an additional 30 millimetres under brown manure vetch at sowing, which is the bottom figure, an additional 70 kilos under the brown manure vetch at sowing compared to the continuous cereal, which is the top figure. And this resulted in an additional 1.5 tonnes under brown manure in a decile 2 growing season. And the pasture treatment still had a yield advantage in addition to setting up a seed bank. So the pasture seed bank for the best treatments was about 1 tonne per hectare. So, and there's a few key differences there between the different systems, and that is that the pastures were left to set seed, so they used more soil water than the brown manure vetch. And also the timing of desiccation meant that it was possible there was more plant available, soil mineral N at sowing under the brown manure treatments compared to the pasture treatments at the time of measurement. So just to summarise the novel sowing methods across the sites, I've made a bit of a colour chart, and this is just showing red highlights poor establishment and poor growth. Orange represents an inconsistent result, and just refer to the note there about why that was inconsistent. And green suggests good establishment and good growth. So it highlights the riskiness of twin sowing just when you see it in the colour chart like that. So as we've mentioned, some of these species were tested because they have the option for seed harvestability. So I'm showing Michael Moodie and Roy Latter's experiment here, which shows that the species with the greatest opportunity for on-farm harvesting is Trigonella and Margarita, Serradella. With so those numbers at the end of the columns are the percent of total seed harvested. So just to conclude this section about establishment methods, summer sowing worked well for some species, but not all, and this differed across environments. The seasonal break timing is a limitation to the adoption of the novel sowing methods in this area, but you will still gain that benefit of the sowing occurring outside of the main cropping program. Autumn sowing was the most reliable for all species, and I haven't gone into the weed data, but we found there was more weeds under twin and summer sowing, and this is because there's no knockdown prior to sowing, unlike the autumn sown treatments. And unless confident in seeding depth placement and there's no furrow infill, twin sowing isn't recommended until that is addressed. So shifting gears slightly now to talk about crop and pasture system benefits. So lay farming systems offer an avenue to increase soil nitrogen, and the re-evaluation of pasture cropping system has sparked this investment in a new generation of annual legume species and their suitability to a range of environments. So while we're interested in low-cost regenerating legume options, we want to also know if they can compete with vetch in our highly evolved annual cropping system. So we had 4 sites and we measured yield either after a 1 or 2 year pasture phase, and all in the 2020 growing season. So this is just highlighting the 2019 legume production prior to the cereal phase. And at each site, vetch had the highest production, and this was followed by strand medic. There are also options there that could compete in a second year at Lamoureux, second year phase pasture with the medic, and as was the case in Piangle. So to just zoom in on those best treatments of vetch and medic, the mean medic pasture break effect was 1.1 tonne per hectare of wheat, and the grain protein was increased by 0.7%. So this is just showing all the legume treatments that were in the Lamoureux experiment. And the point I wanted to make with this slide was that it didn't really matter what pasture species you grew, as long as it was reasonably well adapted and it grew, then the wheat yield benefit was likely to be similar. So this yield response is supported by an increase in soil available nitrogen. So this was 42 and 35 kilos of nitrogen at sowing after vetch and medic, respectively. And to highlight the end fixation of the different species, I have this set of data from Lamoureux, where the highest end fixation came from the single year vetch and field pea of 46 kilos per hectare. And this was followed by the medic treatments. So while there's a clear end response post the legume phase, there are other break effects also occurring. So this figure is showing the removed nitrogen in grain yield and the available nitrogen on the x-axis. And so there's other break effects at play here, shown by that barley point. And this is some other data that I had driven by soil, water, and disease. So I'm now going to hand over to Rick, who's going to talk about the economic perspective on investing in new legume pastures.
Thanks, Bonnie. I've just got a few slides here on a couple of the methods we've used to evaluate these pastures. Just go on to the next one. Now, so we're looking at plot scale or paddock scale, we'll call it. So they're sort of taking a return on investment approach. And I guess that it's a bit similar to what we've been doing with the soil amelioration method, where you're investing up front and then looking at what the benefits are that sort of play out over the subsequent years and whether you're getting a return on investment quickly or not. And in this case, what you'll see is we've assumed establishment costs for the pastures, but we've also assumed that there is some lost income in those early years, particularly in some of these examples where you could have made a handsome profit off a crop if you had been cropping instead of an ungrazed pasture that gets established. So we've taken the Lamoureux results out to 4 years, and then it will also include some farm scale results where you can see what that sort of means at a larger scale. So let's go on to the next one there. So just using the Lamoureux example that Bonnie mentioned, it's just chugging through there, Bonnie.
Oh,
there we go.
sorry, do you want?
So Bonnie referred to this example from the Lamoureux trial site. So you can see there we just compared other things, but in this case, brown manure vetch, a 2-year medic phase, and then a pea crop in 2019. So you can see the medic was over 2 years, so the establishment year first of all. So there's costs involved there, not just in establishment, but also the foregone grain profit. And you also lost some money on the peas. They only yielded under a tonne or about half a tonne. So if you could have grown cereal there, that's why that's dipping into the red there in 2019. But what you're seeing is that payback through those big break crop benefits, or break benefits, I should say, in 2020 and still going up in 2021. So you're seeing it's ending up quite handsome in terms of return on investment, net present value per hectare. And that's even without any grazing, because these trials in this case weren't grazed, some were, that's SARDI run. So you can see that that's all come up in, even the medic has come up close to the brown manure vetch and the peas over that period. And of course, at the end of the medic phase, you're ending up with the new legume seed bank on top of that value. So just go ahead to the next one, Bonnie. This is where I've just factored in some grazing. So let's just assume a really modest amount of grazing, a very light grazing year 1, and $150 hectare livestock return in year 2 because it's entering cropping. So I assumed a shortish season of grazing. So you can see the medic would jump ahead if you did include some grazing and still got those same crop benefits. So that's just an example of that sort of return on investment approach to investing in these pasture seed banks. Next one, Bonnie. Now, taking it out to the farm scales is work by Marta Montegino using the whole farm optimization profit model MIDAS. So let's assume you've got 1,500 hectares of sandy loam on a farm, regenerating pastures. Now, so the average annual legume pasture cost there is $65 a hectare. When you sort of average it out, you've got high establishment costs, but then it's managing the regenerating years comes down to $65 is the assumed amount. A new improved medic, Seraph, let's assume, that can be managed to raise the average legume percent in the pasture sward from a reasonable standard, really, what was 48, but up to 70%. And at the same time, you're raising the pasture production from just under a tonne up to 1.3 tonnes. So you're getting quite an improvement there. We're also comparing with vetch. That's sort of the big aim of all of this. In this case, only 1.1 tonnes forage is assumed based on the trial results, but it has got that $160 annual cost for establishment plus management. So it's high annual costs. Just go ahead, and a quick summary of results when you take things out to that sort of 1,500 hectare. If you can get that pasture improvement that I showed you from below 50% legume up to 70, which is a quality pasture, you're looking at a 25% profit increase with something like introducing SARF at that level. Barometric wasn't too far away, but it was sort of in the mid-range there, sort of 10% above the standard, not 25%. So still an improvement there. But worth pointing out that, including that legume compared to continuous cropping, mainly continuous cereal in this case, was 20% more profitable. So in this example, there certainly is the benefit of mixed farming, as you often see in this sort of modelling enterprise. Profit maximising pasture area. The good thing here is that you're gaining that profit increase without a big increase in the pasture area. So it's still a cropping dominant system going up to 20 to 25% pasture instead of 10 to 15. And that's driven by stocking rate going up by about 1 DSE over the whole farm, over that 1,500 hectares. It's worth pointing out that vetch has still performed strongly despite that relatively modest growth we assumed and the high costs. So it was only 5% less than that whole farm profit from the standard medic, which is quite a reasonable medic. And of course, you've got other flexibility advantages around vetch as well. So you can see how some of those other factors might lead to that being grown, obviously. It's worth pointing out bladder. It's not something that's readily available yet, but bladder clover led to a 15% profit increase, and that was largely driven by that higher digestibility that's assumed for bladder if it was able to be introduced. So lower growth than the medic, but it has got an assumed high digestibility that is a big profit driver. Just to finish off, Bonnie, I think you can handle the conclusions from here on.
Yep. So this concludes our talk. So to summarise, mean wheat yield after medic pasture increased by 1.1 tonne per hectare, and grain protein was increased by 0.7% compared to the continuous cereal treatment. Cereal yield was highly correlated with the end contribution of the legumes, and crop responses after different legumes is similar. It's the legume persistence that varies. The system benefits to cropping from successful pasture establishment phase can pay for establishment costs of a profitable pasture seed bank. And I'll finish there, Tanya.
Great, thanks very much to Bonnie and Rick for that presentation. We do have a bit of time for questions. If anybody has any, you can pop them in the chat. Okay, don't think we're getting anything coming through, but please feel free to keep adding those questions if you do have anything as we go. I will introduce our next three speakers now because we've been joined by Bennett from Lawloit. So we're going to hand over to Michael Moodie, who is from Frontier Farming Systems, and Alison Frischke from BCG to talk about local trial results. And then we're also thankful to Bennett for joining us today to talk about his experience with Sarardella. And I know that his presentation is part of Ali's, so we'll just keep rolling with all three of you until we get to the end. If we do get a question, I'll just chime in at some stage. Otherwise, you'll take us up till the end of the webinar. So Michael, you're going first.
Okay, I'll share my screen.
Okay, sorry, Ali, away you go.
That slideshow? Yep. Can everyone see that?
You just need to go to
It's the wrong one.
presenter mode. Yeah.
No worries. Far away, Michael.
Okay, thanks everybody. Yeah, like I said, well, as previous presenters alluded to, we've been involved in a few different facets of the project. So a lot of our trial data has been presented already. So I guess what I'm going to try and do now is, a bit of a summation of some of the options and where, I think some of the potential farming system changes could lie. So if we skip over, so we've like the trials that have been put up, we've got a bit of a look at a range of different options that we might sort of consider, and I've sort of characterised them into 3 different bins here. The blue bin being obviously the bin that we might look at if we're looking to incorporate these legumes into our farming systems. So annual medic, Serradella, and I've also put vetch there, acknowledging that vetch has really replaced in the mallee, really sort of replaced what traditionally was medic area as well. I've put a maybe bin there, rose, clover, and Biserrula, where there's some features that I think if we wanted to explore further, then there's potential still with those options. And in the red bin, I guess, is where we've got to in terms of in the mallee in our trials and demo paddocks, bladder clover, trigonella, gland clover, stragulus, and arrow leaf clover at this stage. I know there's some breeding work still happening in there, but as the current varieties stand, I don't think are worth a farmer really considering for that, for purposes of a regenerating system. So next page. So the new medic that was discussed earlier, Seraph, it's strand medic. It's been a feature of a lot of our trials, and in terms of how it's compared to the other options we've looked at, it's established quite well from these novel pasture systems that Bonnie talked about, both twin and summer sowing. It's been, in terms of the regenerating legumes, it's been at the top in terms of its productivity, in terms of biomass throughout the season. I've put a table there which is a comparison. I've had some sites within this project, but other projects where we've had basically a comparison at the same site between a regenerating seraph and also a vetch grown on the same site, and you can see reasonably consistently there that the difference between total biomass production is around about a third. So medics, or the seraph medic, is producing about 2/3 of what an equivalent vetch would be at the same site, but the difference that probably isn't highlighted in those numbers is probably the distribution of biomass production through the year. So where vetch is accumulating it quite quickly and basically has finished or running in the seed pod set in early September, even late August. The medic growth has tended to be a bit later, more through the spring period. So if you're looking for longer period of feed, then medic is an option there. And the early maturity of the seraph medic compared to the other options as well has been a feature. A lot of the other options that have been talked about today are quite long in their maturity for the mallee environment, and we have seen instances where we haven't actually been able to set seed in a lot of the other options within some of the poor years, but medic being an earlier maturity has generally been able to set seed in most seasons that we've encountered. Obviously, the cons with the seraph medic, if we're looking at alternative systems and alternative ways to establish it through both twin and summer sowing, is how we're going to access that on-farm seed or on-farm pod to do that. So while it establishes very well from pod, equivalent to other things, currently there's limited opportunities to actually gather enough seed up on farm that can be a viable alternative option, which I think is something that the other parts of the project have been working on. Next slide. So French Serradella, two hard-seeded varieties here, Margarita and the newer variety Frano. We've seen some opportunity. Well, we think there's some opportunities to for farmers to be looking into growing this pasture, and where we think those opportunities are on soils that would traditionally grow lupins, or on soil types where where lupins have been grown previously. So some of the pros for Serradella are the excellent establishment from these alternative methods, such as twin or summer sowing. We've seen excellent production on these sandy, neutral to acidic sandy soils. So not so much once we get onto our loamier, more alkaline soils, but on these vulnerable sort of deep sandy soils, we've seen Serradella perform very well. And also, it has some really good seed yields, and also though that seed can be harvested quite easily and readily using conventional on-farm harvesting equipment, just a normal harvester. Its cons are moderate production on, as I said before, the alternative soil types, the late maturity aspect. So we have seen seasons where we haven't been able to gather seed from the Serradella, just because it's actually the seasons had a terminal drought, and therefore the crops run out of moisture before it's been able to achieve seed set. And the other thing that was alluded to before is persistence through the cropping phase. So where we've established a reasonable pasture in the first year, we've had a reasonable seed set. We then go through a cropping period, and we've seen poor regeneration out the other end. So I think where the option is for Serradella is actually to be looking more closely at these twin and summer sowing, and actually setting up a pasture the year prior or within the year that you want that pasture to be on that soil type. Next slide there, Ellie. And just to touch on the harvestability, you'll see in the picture on the right-hand side there, we had an incredible growth 2 years ago on one of these sandy soil types near Speed. Produced, I think David Peck put a graph up before where we achieved up to 7 tonne per hectare production. You can see the Serradella there in the middle of the picture. And at that site there, we're able to harvest 900 kilograms of seed. But we have had other sites where production hasn't been near that, but we're still able to achieve pretty good seed yields of 220 kilograms per hectare at Pinegal in 2020, and then we established 2 sites last year on larger paddock scale sites that covered a whole hectare, and we were able to achieve sort of 300 to 600 kilos of seed harvested last year, and that's with a fair few harvest losses, so a lot of sort of shedding of seed before we actually are able to get the header there and take off the mature pods. Next slide. So if we're going to think about Serradella in the system, where are its opportunities? Well, I think the aspect that Ross talked about before, that you've got this shared inoculant group with lupin, makes it a really viable option. So sites where we may have had lupins growing in the past, but maybe you're not really that wrapped with growing lupins for all the issues that lupins bring with them, and you're wanting more of a pasture option or a forage option to replace that. This could be a potential option. Obviously, the seed is readily harvestable, so we could set up some sort of smaller nursery sites within the paddock or within the farm to actually generate seed that then can be stored at pretty low quantity over a longer sort of period to utilize that seed when and where you want it. It's requires a pretty low seeding rate, so a small amount of seed is going to go a long way, and the opportunity is really to target the soils through either twin sowing, which is placing the seed with the crop the year prior, or summer sowing the seed out or the pod that you've retained on farm in the summer prior onto specific soil types where you want the Ceradella to perform or be. And then I think you can also investigate other options within the paddock. So perhaps it's a medic or even a sown vetch on the heavier soil types that you might put in, or you might consider even a fallow on the other soil types within the paddock, and therefore those light sands, which really need that sort of kick in nitrogen, are going to be achieving that with the Ceradella. And there are opportunities obviously for grazing or hay, or through paddock renovation through a green manure or brown manure crop as well. Just over to the last slide, please, Ellie. So the maybe bins were rose, clover, and Biserrula. Why have I put those in the maybe bins? Well, when it comes to rose clover, I thought it was an excellent all-rounder. Good at lots of things, but not the best at anything. But its establishment, production, persistence was pretty close to medic on most in most sites that we went to. The seed pod is readily harvestable. So like Ceradella, the seed pod presents itself nicely. You can easily get it into a header, but our problem was unable to thrash it with the harvester. So the seed being so small and light, we could get it into the header, but we couldn't separate it out and get it in. Now that may be something that could be looked at to say how can we actually thresh that, which may be some header settings, or it may be some other things that need to be done there. But if we could actually capture that seed, I think it would perform very similar to Ceradella in terms of that twin and summer sowing option. Over to Biserrula. It was a pasture that we sort of didn't perform very well at the start of all our trials. So it was very difficult to establish, and the seed was tiny. So it was very easily to bury too deep and lacked figure of some of the other pastures. But also it produced, because its seed is so small, it produces an incredible number of seed, or incredible numbers of seeds. So we actually saw that this year, it's after the cropping phase, so after it had that poor establishment year, but it produced some seed, gone through a cropping cycle, its actual growth and production has been really good post that cropping phase. So its Achilles heel might be about getting it established in the first place, but once it's there, it looked like a pretty reasonable pasture option in that post-cropping phase, and presumably on from there. It also has some useful grazing and agronomic traits, I think, that might also offer some potential, such as it's a little bit unpalatable, well, not unpalatable, but the preference for sheep is to graze other things before they graze that. So that's going to help you manage weeds, and also help you increase the nitrogen fixation in that paddock by maximising legume biomass production as well. So that's why I think they're in the maybe bin. With a bit more work, they could be an option, but at this stage, from this project, I'd be recommending both the Seraph Medic and the Margarita. So that's what I had to show there.
Any questions, Tanya?
No. Oh, hang on. We've got a question here from Richard. I'm interested in the collective view of yellow Ceradella. The French Ceradella seems to have performed well and offers some potential, but there seems to have been limited evaluation of yellow Ceradellas. Who can answer that one?
David Peck there?
Yeah, I can have a go at that one. So yellow Ceradellas are much harder to harvest the pods because they end up with a big bean, and they can easily end up as a barrel of monkeys. They're not suitable to the summer sowing, not the current cultivars. There's genotypes that would be suitable to that, but they're not yet cultivars. So if they come on board, there's more opportunities for them. But by and large, they're similar to the French Ceradellas. They're probably a little bit tougher, but they are definitely currently a lot harder. So you can't grow yellow Ceradella followed by yellow Ceradella in the establishment process. But, there certainly is still a species of interest.
Would anybody else like to comment on that from our speaker list?
Yeah, I'd just make the comment that it's probably partly associated with seed cost as well. Because they're very hard, they've got to be de-hulled, and so they're probably a higher seed cost than the on-farm harvested pink Ceradella. And so that's a driver of why I guess the program is focused on the pinks rather than the yellows. But of course, if you can get the yellows established, then often they are comparable to the pinks. But it's really in that establishment phase and cost of seed.
Okay, we have another question from Rowan on, has it much been done on seed softening of Ceradellas? The question's been directed to David, but Ross, you might be able to answer that.
Yeah, so with all this work, there's a level of seed softening studies. So the French, in our experience, there's at least 40% of them soften in the first autumn. So that is why they don't potentially persist as long as some of the others, so as the medics or the yellow Ceradellas. So another thing I need to say for the French Ceradellas, but it's also applicable to the bladder, is when we're talking summer sowing, we're really talking February sowing. Both of them have a very unusual softening process where if they have no light, they break down much more. So when you do your sowing, it must be sown at below the soil surface, and it's not suitable to broadcasting.
All right, thanks very much, David. And thanks to Richard and Ron for the questions. All right, over to you, Ali.
Thank you. I'm just going to take you a bit further south now and present. We hadn't grown these species in our area before, so we went on the variety trial sort of path and slightly different soil type. Just thought I'd start with the rainfall because the responses each year really showed up the rainfall patterns. So Gilgil, just north of Birchup in 2019, we really had no rain up to sowing, but they did happen to have about over 7 inches in the December the year before. So on the sandy sort of site, there was moisture at depths, and at the start of May, we're able to had good rains going into sowing. By the time we got the seed, it was about mid-May, and then average winter rain and a dry spring. So pH here is around the neutral, but increasing pH at depth. And this is just to have a bit of a look at through all the different varieties there. Standard sowing rates, establishment sort of anywhere from 25 up to 140 plants per metre squared. By the end of September, even though we'd had average winter rain, biomass production wasn't very high, and that showed up in one of those previous graphs that year as well. But the highest one, Ceradella, actually took the post that year, and closely followed by the rose and the bladder clover, vetch, and the seraph. I should change that. PM250 is now seraph, but reasonably low production. And there's a couple there, the astragalus and the trigonella, had really good plant establishment levels, but just failed to produce biomass. So there's, lack of adaptation there. We counted seeds, and there's lots of them, up to 28,000 seeds per square metre, extrapolating out from subsamples. But in comparison, that having that soft-seeded vetch there is only 130, but the rabbits found that tasty, and rabbits have been mentioned before as well. It was sown next to a block of scrub and close to a canola crop that grew high and out of reach for the animals, so they like to have a pretty big chomp on our trials come springtime. In 2021, different season going in. As we know, last year it was really dry, really until late May. We had 2 times of sowing in this trial, getting in on the 27th and then at the end of May. And this was at Wachapa, which is northwest of Birchup. And again, a fairly neutral topsoil and basic subsoil. So in this trial, because we had limited time, we bumped the sowing rates up to double to sort of represent a regenerating pasture. So you can see reasonably high sowing rates there. And they were reflected at plant establishment, basically doubled with it as well compared to that dual site. By the start of spring, early vetch Studenitsa was doing really well because, so that's the start of September, we'd had that dry period at the end of August, and for a couple of weeks, and the pastures had really been living off just regular rainfall up until that point. But come the start of September, once we hit that start of September, rain kept coming and we had that good September, October, and biomass really took off then. Just showing that Seraph wasn't, and Bartolo bladder clover wasn't too far behind the Morava in that instance. And we managed to get up to, like in these cuts in early December, over 5 tonne for Arrowleaf for long season 1 and Morava, and then the rest of the group reasonably similar. And then this year the Serradella was a bit less. In that trial too, we had some sowing rates, different sowing rates for the Seraph Medic. Again, seeing similar patterns where establishment increases with increased sowing rate. Biomass, a little bit less so, but by the time we got to later in the season with a good spring, variety sort of caught up and compensated for that early sowing rate, and pod set were a bit the same. Had a time of sowing factor in there as well. We didn't have any difference in establishment between the times of sowing, so both got going well, but in terms of biomass production, early sowing led to greater biomass by the start of September. But by the time I'd reached total biomass following that good spring, it was really only down to cultivar differences. So the nature of the season took over those times of sowing effects. Last year too, Ross organised some seed of Frano Serradella, the new one, and Seraph Medic, and Alan Bennett, who's about to talk in a minute. So these at Lawloit into some about 3 hectares each, and did some counts of plants and dry matter, just as it's been encouraged when you're trying something new, sow it down a slope so that you're looking at different soil types along the way. But it's actually reasonably similar, apart from the midway down the slope for Seraph was a bit lower in plant establishment and then dry matter later on. But otherwise, things matched reasonably well. Flowering, or started flowering, sort of dry matters were taken. You can see that Seraph is a lot earlier than the Frano Serradella. So it's that availability of feed happening at different times of the year there. But by the end of the season, Seraph was performing as well as the Frano Serradella, which was a little surprising, I suppose, because when you have a look at the paddock like this is what it was like at the start of December. There was a tiny bit of green left in the stems of the Serradella there, and it appeared showier because it's upright and aerial, whereas the Seraph is prostrate. But it came out pretty much the same in terms of dry matter production. So both did well there. We just did some strips for a bit of a demonstration, I suppose, of some different chemicals, just to see how well the Frano and the Seraph coped with the different chemicals. So Alan had sprayed it with clethodim in early August, so we just stuck with broadleaf sprays. Now this was getting pretty late in the year. We realised it was a bit late because it was mid-September by the time we got out, and Seraph was just starting to punch out some flowers. But So the 3 groups of chemicals, C, I, and Bs. So this is as far as I know, my knowledge. In the group C, the brinoxidil is registered for pastures, but it will cause damage to medic, and it sure did, compared to the Franoceridella, with the higher score representing more phyto effects on the leaves. For the group I, the buttress, it's registered for both, and a bit of damage expected. And there was, but overall it was a softer chemical on the 2 pastures than some of the other ones. And then the other group Bs, all registered. I'm told broad strike's favoured for medic and spinica for ceradella, but medic in this case really suffered from the broad strike, which is probably related to the time of the year, and people can make comment on that. Happy for that. But the spinica and the ceradella was all right. So it's been talked about having really good weed control is really paramount to establishment, particularly when you've got mixes of pastures going out and your chemical control options are less. But, and also getting those weeds while they're young. Here's just some of the photos showing that the serif is the line at the top and the ceradella along the bottom there. So the bromoxinol really smashed the medic there. The buttress is leaving things looking reasonably good in both departments still. And just to the right there, the red ring is where the broad strike damaged the medic in that instance, whereas spinica wasn't too bad. So I'll hand over to Alan now. If Alan, can you turn your, or Tanya, are you able to turn his camera on? Gotcha. So just we've invited Alan to have a bit of a chat about his experience getting into ceradella and growing it, where he's got it in his system now, and how he finds the performance and management. So over to you, Alan. I've popped your photos up. So.
Yeah, terrific. Thanks, Ali. Look, I got interested because I heard Colin and Anna Butcher speak at a GDC update at NIL in 2015. They're from, I think it's Brookton in WA, and they raved about margarita. So I managed to get a few bags. I also got some yellow ceradella, I think it was Cadiz, and sowed that as well. 2015 was a really tough season. So this is on clayed sand. So all our sands are acidic sand. So that's what I was trying to do. I was trying to find a pasture legume to grow on acidic sand that wasn't clayed, so we don't grow lupins, and very, very hard to find anything that'll do on it. And then we clay and delve them, and we can sow cereals and get them to dry and loosen in the end, but I wanted something in the interim. So we had to go. So that first paddock, 2015 seed crop, I think we sowed it at about 6 or 7 kilos of clean seed. And a tough, very, very tough year. Didn't think it was going to come to anything. Got going. We don't normally grow vetch on that country, but there's 3 paddocks in that block. They're each about 70 or 80 hectares. So the margarita was in the middle. It would have been probably Morava vetch, I guess, either side of it. In the springtime, the Morava vetch gave up, so nest finished. And you can see that November picture. The ceradella was still green. It was still trying to grow, and it was still trying to flower. And I didn't realise, but Heliothus love it. So the Heliothus got it, and we couldn't harvest it. So we went again in 2016, which was a much better season. I grew it on some really mixed acidic sand to buckshot, sodic sort of soil, a little bit of loamy stuff as well, about neutral. Lawloit had a really good seed crop. We harvested it 40 odd hectares, and I've been sowing the pods ever since, with all sorts of mixed results, to be honest. And that's my bottom line for the margarita. It's a bit hit and miss. I've had some really good results. I've tried everything. We've sown it in February. We've sown it in August on some of our unclayed sands up next to the big desert. So we're back down to 300 mils up there. And I sowed it under Sayer oats in August one year, thinking, it'll be there for next year. It came up. It flowered, and it set seed sowing in August. We sowed it in February one year, never saw it. So it's one of those funny things. So 2 photos there. The photo on the right's interesting because that's what tends to happen up on that non-wetting sand. You just can't seem to get it thick enough. So you get some to regenerate, and they'll come up and they'll be like that, massive big plants, and they'll grow really well. I think our winters are too cold. It doesn't like winter. It likes an early break that it can get up and get growing. It'll put up with winter and then just loves a long spring. It'll keep on flowering and keep on setting pods. I've had it all the way through to December. There was one year we found green plants still flowering in January after a rain, and we had a few plants that were there, and we had little plants coming up from plants that had seeded in the springtime. So it's really unusual how to do that. But if there's enough spring and enough rain, it just absolutely loves it. It doesn't grow a lot of biomass in my experience. I've been growing it with Cobra Balanza last couple of years, and the Cobra will just dominate it. Sort of, it's a good mix until if the spring keeps going, the Cobra will just get going, and we've cut some of that for hay. 2017, I had a good crop. So that's in 2020. So the paddock on the left, we didn't cut that for hay. That's weaned lambs. We put that in. So that'd be October. And then the paddock on the right really got going. Same area, same year, just a couple of Ks apart. And we ended up cutting that one for hay. And there was still that margarita in there, but it was just, it just stays above the balancer and it can't really compete for biomass with it. But on that, you see a little bit of ryegrass and stuff there too, that we left that paddock out next year. That was the paddock actually that some of those plants stayed growing until January that year, and some seeded and came up with a January rain. 2017, I was going to say, that paddock where we cut the hay, actually, I had margarita in there in 2017. It wasn't very thick, but there was enough there. We weaned some weather lambs on it. We ended up terminating it. We grew canola next year in 2018, and that was the highest soil in paddock of any of our canola paddocks that we tested that year. So even though there wasn't a lot of biomass, it fixed a lot of N. I think we grew our canola crop there with one application of urea, which wasn't very much. Normally we'll do one up, one under the seed, and two during the growing season. So it certainly did the job for us that year. So we've been sowing these pods off that one. I'm about run out of pods. So I'm to the point now, well, do I sow another seed crop or not? We haven't got a seed crop in the program for this year. We've swung over to more Cobra Balanza, and the other one we're growing with a lot of success now is Woolly Pod Vetch RM4, which will grow in soils that vetch wouldn't even think about it. Acid sands, loamy stuff that'll get wet and horrible, and the vetch will just curl its toes up. And we've had grown it for 2 years. Obviously, last year was a late break and not much spring for us. The year before was a ripper, and it's done the business in both years on some really challenging soils. So that's where we're sort of at the moment, really.
Do we have any questions for any of the speakers?
I'll just ask a question of Alan, Tanya. Alan, what regeneration after crop? What's your perception of things like Cobra Balanza and the French Cerridella? Will it go through one or two crops, come back, or is it something you've got to resow every time?
Well, where we've had the seed crops for the French Cerridella, the margarita, it's still coming up. So that 2016 seed paddock, we've actually sown some RM4 vetch into that now. Actually, my son's just finished sowing it. And when we looked at the paddock to see whether it needed a knockdown or what, guess what? There was little French Cerridella that was coming up. Margarita was coming up. Part of that paddock was sown with the Cadiz, yellow Cerridella, no sign of that. But that if you get it thick enough, I don't think we've been probably sowing our pods heavy enough. We've ended up sowing our pods at about 20 kilos, which is probably just heavy enough. But for a start, we probably weren't sowing the pods heavy enough. The Cobra seems to come back very strongly the year after. I'm not sure. I haven't been growing it long enough to see what's going to happen there. And the other thing with our French Cerridella is that we're growing on paddocks that we don't really crop much. Like we'll sow some cereal into them for sheep feed. And now we're running out a lot of those unclothed sands because we're claying and delving them. So I suppose our goalposts are shifting a little bit.
Are you saying any weird cereal like barley at all anymore?
Yeah, well, we have been. This year probably we won't. But up to this year, since 2015, we've been doing it with cereals. And we have mixed results with that. It's just hard to get it to really get up and get going. And I think in hindsight, I think it's due to the timing of the break and whether it can actually grow while the soils are still warm. You get into wintertime, it'll be there. It'll just sit there, and it really. I don't think it likes that cold winters. I don't think it like. And a lot of these, coarse textured sands are very prone to getting frosted. So you know, they're probably getting hammered with frost during the winter. And like I said, it just loves a long spring, which I know in some ways will say it's a disadvantage, but it really does push that growing season out into the springtime when a lot of other things like vetch have just said, nah, my time's had it.
So it's probably it's up against too much competition with the barley for like a vigorous cereal, and then competing for light and wants to sit there cold during winter. And yeah, you'd really have to graze the barley down to let the Sarrodella get going later. Yeah.
Like I said, the best results I've had are with Sayer oats that are sown late. And Sayer oats on that sandy country, you only really need a rain to get them to come up. And then if you get another rain, you think they're not going to come to anything, you'll get a rain in October or something and bang, off it'll go. But they tend to, you know, there's not very much leaf on Sayer oat. It's tall and spindly. And that's where I've had these results where I'm thinking, oh, yeah, I'll sow this Sarrodella in August and it'll be there next year. And then it's actually come up and gone to seed. And then we did actually have it regenerate the next year in those seed furrows where you just get enough soil. And the other thing we found with those paddocks is if you can graze them over summer, you'll get way better germination the next year because the sheep are actually disturbing the soil and covering up the seed in the seed furrow. If you don't run the stock over them, like we had one situation where we left the Sayer oats because out on that country we quite often leave barley as a standing crop to graze in the autumn time for autumn lambing ewes. Well, we did that with Sayer oats, but the emus just harvested the oats. And we had very little Sarrodella come up in those situations because we hadn't run the stock over it to physically break the plant up and incorporate the seed and cover it with a bit of soil.
Great. Okay, we have another question here. I've had two come through at the same time. We might stick with Alan. Any experience using Sarrodella in longer term pastures?
Well, like I said, we have, and we also have dryland lucerne, and we sow cereals and stuff into dryland lucerne as well for extra winter feed, and we do winter cleaning and stuff like that. So in a lot of our country, we've got a background level of this French Sarrodella. But like I said, it's, to me, how it performs is very seasonal dependent. If you get the right situations for it, you really notice it. And other years you'll drive around and go, oh, there's a plant of Sarrodella, because you don't see many. Like, it's just, that's what I said initially, it seems a little bit hit and miss. It's not a solid performer where you know what you're going to get, or it's going to, like, I suppose RM4 vetch and growing at 2 years, I think, well, it just looks like it's going to do the business every year. Whereas Sarrodella, you know, it'll, sometimes you get a really good one, and like a lot of these paddocks, that's what they are. They're pasture. We're 50-50 cropping and pasture. We're not trying to really, we only crop these light soils to try and improve them or get a bit of biomass or, you know, clean up weeds and stuff like that, really.
Great, thanks, Alan. We've got another question here from Richard. This one's for you, Rick. Bladder seemed to perform well in the economic analysis, but Mick Moodie had it in the rubbish bin. How did it do so well in the analysis?
I mean, Michael had positive rubbish bins and other bins, but I think on the Lamoureux results, it actually did okay, did pretty well. So I think those inputs into that modelling were probably more based on those than some of the areas where it failed. I mean, you see a lot of diversity in performance across, you know, the 3 states, basically. Ross might want to add to that, or Bonnie as well, because it's based on the performance, although the growth assumptions were relatively low, but like I mentioned, it did assume higher digestibility, which does make quite a difference in the economic analysis for livestock performance.
I think the comment I would make, Tanya, about the bladder is where we've seen it perform well. It's a little bit like Alan was saying. It's in the better seasons with a bit of late rainfall. That's where it really hits its strap. And the year we saw it at Lamoureux was above average rainfall, and it grew really well there in that year. Prior to that, we'd had it in smaller plots, and it was virtually set a lot of seed, but very little biomass. So again, a lot of these alternatives are hit and miss depending on soil type and season. So it's sort of understanding where they fit in the niches, I think, if you're going to use them.
Okay, we've got another question here. Is it soil type or farming system that is the barrier to subclovers?
David's ducked out, but I can probably make a comment. I think it's probably soil type, rainfall and cropping system. Probably with the subs, you're except for maybe the recent release of Tammin, you're probably back in the 40 to 60% hard seed levels. So at best, they're going to go through one cycle of crop. In a lot of cases on the sandy loams, they're just not going to be adapted to the soil type, I think. So there's a number of issues, and they all, it's never a single thing. They all aggregate together. And on balance, certainly in our very low rainfall systems where you're seeing 2 or 3 years of cropping, I mean, you never see a subclover make it through.
Can I just add that we're still sowing subclovers, but not on our really acid sand. So it's more on our alcohol, more on our neutral, slightly acidic soils. We grow Trichala and Seaton Park and Bennett, both standbys. We've tried a bit of the aerial seeding ones. Not Antastic's a bit too long for us. There was another one we tried. Doesn't matter anyway. But we're still growing. I mean, in the right conditions, they really do well. But it's these, for us, it's those challenging non-wetting sands, really, poor sands that they don't perform on. You'll see them on the better areas where it's a bit wetter, where there's a bit more clay or whatever. But on those really poor white sands, we just don't see them perform or persist.
Great comments there, Alan. Thank you. On that note, we've got a minute to go. I'd love to throw over to Ross quickly, just to give us a bit of a summary of where to with this project. There's a lot of information that's been generated over the last few years. Where can people find it?
So, look, I think there'll still be a fair bit of extension material coming out, Tanya, and I guess keep your eyes peeled for some of the new releases. I mean, there will be a couple of new medics and maybe a Trigonella coming out down the track also. So just keep an eye out for those. What else would I say? Yeah, that's probably summarise it. And I think that the other thing, if people are going to try some of these alternatives, I think as both David and Michael said, they are a little bit, or everyone has said, they're a little bit hit and miss. So if you're going to go for the alternatives, start with small areas of them, maybe put them up and down soil types just to see how they go. And the other thing with the alternatives, I say that the longer term perspective is important, whether they're going to actually make it through a cropping system. Things like medics are well understood, and we know they're reliable in their regeneration, where some of these other things will be a little bit hit and miss. Just as a final comment, I'd just say a lot of information's been presented today, and it's at fairly sort of high level. But if anyone's got any specific questions, I mean, David and myself as a first starting point are happy to address them if you're looking for any more sort of conversation about what you might use on particular soil types, cropping systems and environments. Just drop us an email and we'll follow up on that.
Great. Thank you very much, Ross. We might finish up on that statement. I want to thank all our speakers for joining us today. It's been a really good summary of what's been happening in the project. Thanks very much, Alan, Bennett as well for joining us. We've got a lot of theory from the experts, but it's great to hear some actual farmer practice on how it's actually working in the field. So that's been fantastic. For all our participants and anyone who's logged in online, you will get a follow-up email with a link to the recorded webinar, and we will promote that through social media as well. So if anyone does have any other questions, just remember you can always reach out to your local farming systems group. BCG and MSF have been involved in this particular webinar, but there are other groups working across the country on this project. So we're here to help, and thanks again for joining us. That's it.
Okay. Thanks, Tanya.
Everyone.